Hello and welcome. She was Ireland's first female president and eventually stepped down to become the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. Her direct manner often generates controversy, but that hasn't slowed down her efforts to challenge human rights violations around the world. This week on One on One, meet Mary Robinson. Born to a family of doctors, Mary Robinson traces her roots to both rebels and servants of the Crown. She attended Dublin's Trinity College, unheard of for a Catholic, and defied her parents' wishes by marrying a Protestant. In 1990, she was elected President of Ireland and is credited as having revitalised and liberalised a previously conservative and largely ceremonial office. Robinson stepped down 4 months before her term ended to become the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, a cause she's extremely passionate about. Her newest project is Realising Rights, the Ethical Globalisation Initiative. Outspoken on issues of contraception and gay and lesbian rights, as well as the role of the Church, Robinson continues to be an important symbol for Ireland's growing success. Mary Robinson, great to have a chance to chat with you. Now, if you were to describe yourself, would it be politician, activist, diplomat? Because you've been all three. Which is more accurate?
I think it's basically a human rights advocate in the different positions that I've held, whether it's a lawyer using law for social change, using the position as President of Ireland to emphasise our heritage and what we were trying to do. Then obviously when I was UN High Commissioner, and now I'm President of something called Realising Rights, so I haven't changed my spots.
Tell me about that, the Realising Rights, the Ethnic Globalisation Initiative. You launched that in October 2002 with other notables such as Jimmy Carter and Desmond Tutu supporting it. And it's really about human rights as a sort of global governance issue, isn't it?
In a way, it's about bringing human rights into the central position that was intended by the Universal Declaration, that human rights would be on the side of those who are marginalised, who are very poor, who are very vulnerable. But I learned from my travels as UN High Commissioner that very often the poorest people feared the words human rights. They meant, you know, aggressive, accusing, and they weren't holding governments accountable, they weren't helping them. So we're trying to say right to health is not negotiable. Everybody should have access to basic health care. And if you look at African countries, the health systems are broken. So we're trying to be operational. We're saying that the human face of globalization is migrants. And yet the world is becoming increasingly harsh and repressive and suspicious, especially post 9/11.
You gave a considerable amount of time to the United Nations as a Commissioner for Human Rights. How do you regard the United Nations and its evolution and the kind of change it's gone through? Is it progressing? Is it going to have any real impact in the future?
I sometimes characterize the United Nations the way that Winston Churchill talked about democracy, that it's the worst system except for all the others. We don't have another. And actually, when you work within it, you see that a lot of the UN is incredibly important. In human rights terms, it's all those normative standards that we can hold governments to. The problem is implementation, and that's partly the role of governments who are the members of the Charter of the United Nations. And I always felt as High Commissioner that I served the first 3 words of the UN Charter, which is we the peoples. Okay, the governments were my bosses and they sometimes made life difficult for me, but it was the peoples who were served. And UNICEF does the same with children, UNFPA with population, with a very good report recently on women and migration, and all the other services that the UN provides without which the world would collapse, like weather, like transport, all the regulation of that. What people judge the UN on is the political, the Security Council, and very often that doesn't meet the standard we would like. But the reason is because the members, being the governments, don't want it, for example, to be effective in Darfur at the moment. It's terrible what's happening in Darfur, and we could be much more effective, but there isn't the political will.
And based on what you've seen, are you more optimistic now than when you started all this, or are you tending to be a little bit despondent about it?
I think psychologically I'm the kind of person who prefers to see the glass, if not half full, at least 10%. I used to come back from terrible areas of crisis, of conflict, and my colleagues would sometimes say, but how can you sound positive? And I think it's more energizing. I think it's the way to try to construct, even out of the most difficult situations, how do we move forward? So I prefer to try to harness energies for change, but I'm also prepared to be very blunt and very direct, because diplomatic language is important in its place, but so is direct talking, especially to those with power.
That's what I was going to ask you. I mean, I know you are known to be a direct speaker and you're direct in tackling issues, but you're also, I would say, arguably considered more a diplomat than a confrontational person. So what particular qualities do you feel you have as a person that allow you to face these challenges, you know, to be able to take on the challenges?
Well, certainly when I was UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, I had to stand up to bullies. I had to look at people directly and say, this is not acceptable, you are doing X and Y and it's not on, and I have the authority of the United Nations, etc. Instinctively, I think I like to try and, as I say, problem solve, and I do play to my strengths as a woman leader. I felt that very much when I was elected the first president of Ireland, the first woman president, that I would do it consciously as a woman leader. And women tend to be more inclined to try to be problem solving, to empower the whole group to participate, to share, to be open. In other words, we tend to be less hierarchical about power, and I found that to be a strength.
From what I've read about you, a lot of your strength of character comes from the fact that you came from an environment of family life where you were the only girl among four brothers in, you know, a traditionally Catholic family in Ireland in the 40s and 50s, which was traditionally male-dominated too. So what are your earliest memories of that time and growing up as a young Catholic girl in that time?
I think I was very lucky. First of all, I had these four brothers, so I had to be interested in human rights. Secondly, both our parents were doctors, and it's not that they spoke all the time about equality, but they conveyed very deeply to me that I had the same potential, that they would give me all the opportunities of my brothers, and more importantly, my brothers shared in the household chores. So they were doing a lot of washing up and a lot. In fact, they used to say that as the daughter, I tended to be spoiled or whatever. But the point was that my parents understood that if you're going to have real equality, you must have equality in sharing the home responsibilities. And I think that's a very, very fundamental. Otherwise, women who want to have careers outside the home have to become superwomen and get terribly tired and exhausted because they're also doing the main work in the household. I'm glad that more young men, my son-in-law and my daughter, I have now 2 grandchildren, he is a modern father, and it's wonderful. It's wonderful for his children.
Now, apart from being progressive, your parents also are part of a long line in sort of Irish history and immigrant history where it was very colourful. Have you had a chance to explore that?
Yes, and there are interesting strains because part of my family worked, as Ireland had been a colony, on the colonial judicial service in particular, and were knighted by the Queen. And another uncle took part in revolutionary Irish Republican movement, and that linked me a little bit. And when I became president, I put a light in the window of my residence to link with all the Irish who had emigrated. And it really was a powerful way of getting back some of the attention and the movement back of successful Irish migrants. And now I'm trying to encourage, for example, African countries to link with their diasporas, to link with that power. But you asked me about my family background, being brought up as a Catholic at a nuns' boarding school in Dublin. When I was a law student, I realised that one of the things that needed to happen in Ireland was to open up the laws, not to have the special position of the Catholic Church and the laws prohibiting contraceptives, prohibiting divorce, if we were to be a modern, inclusive state. So that was a very early situation for me, and it was the most difficult issue when I was a young senator. I said that I would promote legislation legalising the availability of contraceptives. Up to then, the contraceptive pill was only available to married women if they had cycle regulation problems. So it must have been the weather, but there were a lot of married women with these problems, and condoms were not available to be bought or sold. And this was, again, an anomaly in a modern state.
Going back to what you said, that light in the window became actually quite a big symbol and was sort of adopted by the people in Ireland as a sort of, again, going back to their roots, wasn't it?
It was, because the light was also in our kitchen and it could be seen from the road. And that, I think, symbolised the light at Christmas, the light that meant a lot. But I found when I travelled as president to other countries, very often a large group of Irish who were there to meet their president would begin by saying, "We know you have a light in the window." I mean, it travelled, and symbols are so important, and they're so important in our modern world, as is language. And that's part of some of the divides we're seeing opening up.
You were a little rebellious yourself in that as a Catholic you married a Protestant and your parents didn't come to your wedding. What kind of impact did that have on your relationship with them?
Well, first of all, it meant that I had to be very sure of the primary relationship, because I did have to go against my parents' wishes. It was complex. It was partly religion, partly they felt nobody was good enough for this wonderful daughter, you know, the way parents can be. And I'm very glad I made that decision. 36 years later, it was the best decision I ever made. But it was tough at the time. And sometimes I think I say to young people in particular, because when I introduced that legislation as a 25-year-old senator, I got terrible criticism. I was denounced by bishops. I was criticized by newspapers. I got hate letters. And I wobbled and wondered, you know, can I really take this? And then I found it inside, it's important to do it. So even personal decisions, you have to sometimes take a stand, even with your family. But also in public life, if you want to be somebody who does something worthwhile, you've got to be prepared to take criticism, be prepared to pay the price, and keep going.
You did heal the rift with your parents eventually.
Very quickly.
Good.
Very quickly.
And in terms of how you've then managed your own family, your own children, your son and two sons and a daughter, how have you made sure they're sheltered from the kind of public life exposure that you've had? How have you avoided putting their heads on the block too?
I've often asked, how do you balance home and a career? And I think the most important thing for me, and this is a personal thing, was that our 3 children knew that they were my priority.
Well, Mary Robinson, don't go away. We're going to be back with more one-on-one with Mary Robinson in just a moment.